Socialists, or collectivists, notice that a big company is exploiting consumers by charging them outrageously high prices for goods and services that don't justify the cost. And the collectivists think to themselves, how can I use the government to impose rules and regulations to force this company to stop exploiting consumers? While capitalists or individualists, on the other hand, look at the same big exploitative companies and think to themselves, how can I crush them through competition? In other words, how can I create similar goods and services that would provide the same value to consumers but charge them a lower price? This way, I can benefit, the consumers can benefit, society can benefit, and the exploitative company is put out of business. The most interesting aspect of this is the evidence for which system actually works better at reducing the power of big monopolistic companies. And the proof that the individualist or capitalist system works better is that all the big monopolistic companies that exploit consumers actually advocate for the collectivist or socialist system with more rules and regulations on businesses. And the reason they prefer this system is because they understand that once the government has the power to enact rules and regulations to stop them from exploiting consumers, they can use the same government power to their advantage by colluding with politicians to enact rules that benefit them instead of harming them. They can lobby or outright bribe politicians and lawmakers to enact rules that stifle competition instead of restricting their ability to exploit consumers. And even if it's not that overt, the big monopolistic companies have enough money and enough resources to comply with any new rules and regulations that you try to impose on them. They can pay higher wages to their employees, they can pay higher taxes, they can hire teams of lawyers, accountants, and other professionals to find loopholes or deal with any amount of government oversight. But you know who doesn't have the money and resources to deal with these additional rules and regulations? The smaller competitors who actually want to provide the same goods and services to consumers at lower prices. So more rules and regulations on companies actually forces out competition from smaller companies. And this ensures that big monopolistic companies can continue to charge exorbitant prices because their customers don't really have too many alternatives. This is an example of unintended consequences, where using government force to solve a problem actually makes the problem worse. This is clear when you consider that Apple, Amazon, Google, Meta, and other large companies all donate to the Democratic Party, which claims to be against big companies and wants to impose more rules and regulations on companies to restrict their power and influence. If the individualist, free market, competitive system with less rules and regulations was actually better for these big companies, wouldn't they donate to parties that support less regulations instead of a party that wants to impose more? But the fact that they consistently advocate for more regulations, more rules, and more government oversight proves that the collectivist or socialist system actually works against small businesses and favors the big corporations. And a common criticism of free competition is that the big corporations simply buy out their smaller competitors once they pose a threat. That's true, and it actually does happen, but that's still much better than the alternative, which is letting companies collude with politicians to enact rules that would stifle competition. Besides, this doesn't stop new competitors from arising once one of them is bought out by the monopoly. And all it takes is one persistent individual to stop this cycle and refuse to be bought out by the big monopolistic companies. And if you think this will never happen, then what you're saying is that you don't trust even one benevolent stranger to do something good for society. In which case, why would you want to give strangers government powers and trust them to make rules that actually regulate corporations and benefit society, instead of just accepting donations from these corporations to benefit themselves? And to address another common criticism, if you think that the big corporations will aggressively reduce their prices in order to drive out the smaller competitors, then that actually solves your initial problem, which is that the consumers are no longer being exploited. In fact, they're getting lower prices than ever. And if corporations raise their prices again after driving out competition, then competition will just arise again once prices are high. And this cycle will just repeat until the corporations start charging fair prices. And finally, if you think that there are no competitors that are capable of creating similar goods or services for lower prices in the first place, then that means that the corporations are not really exploiting consumers, they're just charging fair prices. To sum it up, if you're worried about corporations exploiting customers by charging higher than necessary prices, the best solution is to have less rules and regulations and reduce barriers to competition, rather than try to enact more rules and regulations to force companies to change their practices. Because the corporations, with all their money and power, will lobby rulemakers to work in their favour and enact rules that actually benefit them by making it harder for competition to arise, instead of making rules that force corporations to reduce prices.